Dumisani, you spoke so eloquently about the relationship that Jews have had with blacks in America. I think there's a natural affinity. We have similar stories, enslavement and the like. And I've been a huge fan of Dr. King. I've studied his sermons, and he worked off the whole Yetziat Mitzrayim, the whole Exodus from Egypt narrative in the Bible, in framing the civil rights movement. And Jews are so proud of the part we played. I don't want to over exaggerate it, but there was a significant part, not just Heschel, like you were mentioning, and that's an incredible part of our history. So obviously when there's anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, and we're living in those times now, unfortunately, right. Can you give us a little insight why there would be, it seems like the anti-Semitism that's coming, let's say, from the African-American black community seems to be coming from this Black Hebrew Israelite group. Okay. And maybe you can tell us who these people are, why they believe they are the real Jews. I know there was this huge rally and march outside of Barclays Center in Brooklyn recently. Maybe you can help me and our listeners understand, who they are, what is your opinion of them, and what we could do to deal with them. Because, the Jersey City attack, I think, was born out of that group as well. There seems to be something very dangerous to this group. If you could tell us a little about them.
There's a very radical element to that. And so let me back up here. So the entire idea of the Black Hebrew Israelites or African Israelites, sometimes there's different names, right? Before there was what we're seeing now as this, it's a fringe, but it's radical. And it's unfortunately, as you just noted, Rabbi, violent, which happened, the Mansei stabbing there during Hanukkah a few years ago, followed by the Jersey City shooting and other things that have happened here, right? What you've had here, I was just sharing this on another interview, that there has been a contingent of Black Americans who have had an affinity and gone towards Judaism and the Jewish faith and the Jewish people since Reconstruction. You're talking about now in the 1800s after the Civil War, right? Mm-hmm. The majority of the community was always Christian, right? For lots of different reasons. We can kind of unpack that a little bit, which was the underpinning for our faith in our cohesion as a people, right? The Negro spirituals, Go Down Moses, Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. There's always this connection, not just in terms of the Bible, but particularly in the Old Testament, right? Particularly the Jewish Bible, right? Many of those songs were set in that time. So the reason I'm mentioning that, because there's always been this deep affinity, right? Harriet Tubman was called Moses, right? We talked about this, like you just said, Rabbi, all these parallels, our enslavement for centuries in this country, followed by another century of Jim Crow segregation. So these songs that we sang, and you even mentioned Dr. King using those allusions to Moses, we know hours before he was killed, one of the last things he does, he talks about out of the last section of the Torah portions, right? I've been to the mountaintop, I've looked over, I've seen the promised land. Okay. So that was nothing new. It was newer for a lot of other people who were watching it on television, right? But for Black people in churches, we heard those things all the time, right? Our pastors were always making those connections from the prophets and from the children of Israel to us as a people, right? This whole supersessionism was never a part of that thing. Somehow we are the real Jews and people who are of lighter skin are fake Jews. This was not part of the equation. This is something that came much later on. And I'll also give in terms of history, there was a group, and still is a group that goes back again to the earlier part of the 20th century they called them, some of them were called covenant keepers, some of them called Sabbath keepers, that have been people who've had their own version of Judaism. Some of them would go on to convert to Orthodox Judaism. This has been going on for a very, very long time. So the Black Hebrew Israelites of that older tradition, they have their headquarters in Chicago. Rabbi Capers Fune, he's actually over the Israelite Board of Rabbis, right? And it's a thriving community that goes across the country, right? They are not in any way affiliated with this other group that you're talking about, who preach this hatred for Israel, hatred for Jews, or claiming that Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews are fake. Any of those types of these are completely separate things. The sad part is that those names similar. It's almost like somebody taking your name and starting this whole fringe cult group, and then they're going to immediately associate it with you because it's your name, and you have to spend time in each interview explaining, no, that is not what this is. So it is dangerous, unfortunately. It has come about, in my opinion, and now I'm using me personally, I have been observing that this group, the more radical that you're talking about now, since the 90s. I became first aware of the whole Black Hebrew Israelite thing, everything from the group that's in Dimona, Israel, that you may know of, to the group that I just explained that's based in Chicago, to this other group, which I unpack all of this in my book, Zionism in the Black Church, that either stand on the street corners and yelling at people and calling people Amalek or Edom, all those other, right? These type, using the King James Version Bible, trying to explain to other Jewish people that they don't know what they're talking about, when in reality that it's them that it's actually confused, right? So this has been brewing for a while.
You're saying from the 90s. You're saying from the 90s.
From the 90s is when I began I became first aware of the groups when I began doing some studying, probably mid to later 90s. The internet was still a newer thing. It wasn't like it is. There was no social media, as you know, there's no YouTube, Facebook, social, Twitter, none of those types of things. And I remember saying to my wife, I was in my 20s at that time. I'm 55 now, 56 now, 55 now. And I remember saying to her, because there were some things that were appealing to it, because these were Black people talking about Israel, talking about Judaism from a Black perspective. But the radical element was always something that kind of turned me off. It's like, okay, but I can understand. And I learned about the Igbo, West Africa, the Lemba, Beta Israel, these things that they're just kind of, I grew up as a Christian. I had never even considered.
And so the original roots of this were in the Christian, like say Baptist church, and then they just kind of radicalized it a little in the 90s. Is that what
no,
you're
Rabbi?
saying?
So the 90s part of it for me is just when I became aware. It goes way back before then, right? I became aware of this group and some of them that were preaching some of the hate. Again, not so there was no social media in the 90s. That's when so my arc was finding out about Black Hebrew Israelites. I found about the group that's in Dimona, who their leader was, when they came there in the 60s, some of the controversy around that and everything like that. And I started to see that. It was later on, I began to understand that there's a synagogue in Chicago that's actually this group led by Rabbi Capers Funay that does a lot of work throughout the Jewish community. They don't preach this hate. They don't preach that they are the real Jews and Jews that are not Black or fake Jews, that type of thing. I saw these separations. And then later on, the very radical one that I began, these are almost in stages as I was learning about them, right? I began to learn about.
I used to see them always on like these, I don't know, obscure cable stations.
Yes.
And there'd be a guy reading from the Bible.
Yes.
Bad translation. And then someone else just sort of egging him on. Yeah. Come on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then sometimes you see him on the street doing that, but
that's still the thing now.
That's still going on. And Kanye West, who also said he's he claims he's also Jewish.
Yes,
is that because he also subscribes to their view? I mean, is he a Black Hebrew Israelite?
To our knowledge, and I mean, ours in terms of our organization, what we've observed with Kanye, no, I don't think so. He for the last at least couple of years has been very vocal about his Christian heritage, right? One of his last albums was Jesus is Lord or Jesus is King, I believe it is. And so that has been his purview. I believe he was maybe raised Christian, maybe a Christian home. I don't know a lot about the background in that sense. But to our knowledge, he's never associated with the Black Hebrew Israelites of any group. As a matter of fact, the rabbi that I told you about, who's over the Israelite Board of Rabbis, just did an article in the Forward, right? And he basically denounced what Kanye, people like that are saying, even to explain how it's actually really negatively impacting their actually community, right? Because of the things that he's saying, and people are thinking that he's either a part of this group or that group. To our knowledge, he's not a part of any group. Now, here's the thing, Rabbi, that you're alluding to probably. This mentality, however, that has become more of a cultural thing, whereas meaning the Black people of America, particularly those who descended from the African transatlantic slave trade, are the, quote, real Jews. That has been something that has been pervasive in certain segments of society for a while. So Kanye could have said it based on any number of things. I know personally, like I said, since the late 90s, I've seen it and heard it, and it's all just kind of grow in society.
And what's the basis? And can you walk us through whether it's Kanye West's belief or it's the Black Hebrew Israelite group's belief? Why do they believe they're Jews?
Well, so you have now specifically this radical group, like you're talking about, the ones who preach this, or unfortunately even the violence things that we've seen. Their doctrine, if I can bottom line it, is that not only are they the real Jews by virtue of the transatlantic slave trade, one of their favorite texts is Deuteronomy chapter 28. And when you get to those last few verses, God says through Moses that you're going to be taken as slaves in ships back to Egypt. That whole section that's there, they point to that as well as a few other verses. Say, based on this, we are the people taken on slave ships, as if there was no other slave ships that ever existed in mankind until the transatlantic slave trade. So they'll point to those verses, the last couple of verses of Deuteronomy, and say, this is the main evidence that suggests that the people from the transatlantic slave trade are Jews, and the only Jews that exist. These people, regardless of their tribe that they came from in West Africa, anything that's where that mentality comes from, and it kind of builds from there.
So it's a biblical. It's a because I'm looking it up. I pulled out a chumash, a Bible here. So you're saying from the end, Mark. You got to call him Mark.
Mark,
called you by your first name.
Right.
We're both men of the cloth here, you know.
Yes.
By the way, thank you so much. This is really enlightening and helpful because there's a lot of. I'm ignorant of this, and I imagine most Jewish people don't really understand because, and I think it's important for us to understand. So you're saying, well, it's at the end of chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, which speaks about you'll be left few in number instead of having been like the stars of heaven. You'll have not been hearkened to the voice of Hashem your God. It will be that just as God rejoiced over you to benefit you and multiply you, so will God cause them to rejoice over you, to make you perish and to destroy you, and you will be torn from upon the ground to which you come to possess it. God will scatter you amongst all the peoples from the end of the earth to the end of the earth. So they believe that these verses are referring to specifically black people as they were brought over on boats to be sold as slaves here in America.
Yes, especially that last verse, verse 68, when it talks about slaves and ships, that very, very last verse.
Yeah.
Particularly that one. But no, you're right. It answers your question.
No, so I'm not up to that actually yet. That was 64.
Okay,
65 says, among those nations you will not be tranquil. There'll be no rest for the sole of your foot. 66, your life will hang in the balance. You'll be frightened. 67, in the morning you will say, who can give back last night? And then 68, God will return you to Egypt in ships.
Yes.
Okay, This is on the way of which I said to you, shall never again see it. Wait, so they take from God will return you to Egypt in ships, but how does that have to do? They're coming from...
What they'll do, they'll say Egypt is a metaphor because, of course, Israel and Egypt are landlocked, right? I mean, you don't have to go in the water to Egypt. They'll say Egypt is a metaphor. Therefore, he is describing slave ships, and they go from there right to the 16th century transatlantic slave trade, or 17th century, 1619 transatlantic slave trade. They say, therefore, this refers to Black Americans, only Black Americans, and anyone else who does not come from that legacy are frauds, are fake Jews, so on and so forth. That is the kind of the linchpin of their doctrine.
And that's their main source. And even though I mean, it's referring, I guess, in the future, that God will return you to Egypt in ships. You will never again see it, and you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as slaves.
Yes, sir.
But there will be no buyer. Now, what does that mean? I mean, there was a buyer, unfortunately.
Right. Exactly. So again, to answer your question, Rabbi, there's these different definitions that they'll use. None of it based in the Hebrew, right? So we've done studies on these passages.
But it doesn't even make sense in the English.
Right. So I'm saying it's very mysterious, right? But what it is that, so let me say this for everyone who's listening. So I have in my studies, and I know there's many people in the Jewish community who know this already. There's a debate about it. The Igbo, or one of the tribes that were taken in West Africa, they believe, and I do as well, just from studying the materials, that they are actually literally from the tribe of Gad. They talk about the Assyrian invasion, how they wound up there. So here's the thing, Rabbi. If that is true, and I'm a person, and whoever's listening to it doesn't believe it, I'm not foisting it upon you. It's something I believed for years. And I talked to Igbo elders and everything like that, both in Nigeria and in the diaspora, right? And some who live in Israel, right? So I believe that's the case. And if that's the case, there's a percentage of Igbo that were taken in the slave trade. So in that sense, if that's true, then there were slaves on the ships who are actually from the tribe of Israel, from the descendants of Jacob. Having said that,
to say, Dumisani, that's entirely possible. That's entirely possible. Exactly. My friend Rudy Rockman. I'm sure, I don't know if you know Rudy, but he's done a lot of work with the Igbo tribe and other groups in Nigeria who he believes, and some other Jewish people believe, could actually be Jewish.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Um, um,
I share that sentiment. One of the main leaders and the elders of the community, his name is Remy Alona. And if anybody wants to Google him, Remy Alona,
mhm,
he's one of the leaders of the Igbo community. He's actually a professor now at Riverside in California. He moved to the
mhm.
United States several years ago. And a very, very amazing man, very, very well, several books on the subject and everything. And it goes back centuries, the actual Igbo connection, the Biafra region. It's so much information that's actually there. So what we're doing right now, Rabbi, you and I are engaging in an intellectual and biblical conversation about the possible legitimacy of some of those transatlantic slave trade stolen cattle, if you will, chattel slavery, were actually Israelite. That, however, unfortunately, as we're talking about now, to go from there to only black people are Jews, of course, then becomes the radical, right? Exactly, right.
Right,
It's like
no,
saying,
but this is helpful. You're illuminating
right.
it for me.
Well,
Yeah.
it's like saying just because there are Jews, Persian Jews still in Iran, somehow everybody in Iran is Jewish. I mean, there are Jews who returned to Israel from Kaifeng, China. Therefore, everyone in China is Jewish.
Right.
That's the ludicrousness of it. But when you mix that with a certain amount of black nationalism, when you mix that with a certain amount of grievance politics over the last several decades, when you put all of these things together, then what happens is that those people who are actually spewing these things, they're able to tap into and dissatisfaction and saying, the reason why for high crime in this area, the reason why is because you are the real Israelites. Those are the imposters. And now we see kind of where we are today.
Wow. And I really appreciate, I guess what's happening is this radical view is conflated, as you said, with black nationalism, grievance politics. How influenced is your typical African American by this ideology? I mean, and do you have any idea how large these groups are, the Black Israelites?
I really,
Yeah.
oh, you're good. I'm sorry.
But I'm more interested in hearing how influential this idea is.
Right now, Rabbi, when we talk about this radical part, we don't know what, and I'm saying that is because there hasn't been a study, survey, that type of thing. What I could do personally is tell you my purview over the last 30 years. I can tell you that it has grown from what I saw it in the 90s till now. But what that growth is relative to, I couldn't tell you. So here's what we've noticed across the country. Now, here's where the benefit of me as serving with KUFI and now obviously with IBSI, I get to travel the country talking to black pastors, leaders from different parts, right? And gets a feel. So it seems to be growing, particularly around young black men, right? Who were formerly Christian, right? They were either parts of churches and they were told, and here's the other thing, Rabbi, let me take a little pause here and unpack this for a minute. Part of what is happening where black Christians are concerned, for these young black men, many of them, some of them who are being pulled in, it has more to do, and I've told pastors this as well, more to do with their lack of biblical foundation than it does with the slick messaging and marketing of the thing. Those things kind of converge. In other words, much of what has happened over the decades, and this has been fascinating for me to notice, that as preaching in the church has become more and more, and I'm generally speaking, I'm not speaking to everybody, more and more superficial, more and more what I would call more like a positive messaging and not really delving into scripture. And what I mean by that, for my Jewish friends, I want you to understand, there's deep theology in the sermons, in the older sermons. There was deep theology when it comes, Christian theology, when it came to the Negro spirituals. Deep theology is something like lift every voice and sing. If you've ever studied those stanzas, especially the last one, there's allusions to Jeremiah 51. I mean, there's a lot of faith in God based in scripture where these black leaders are concerned. Well, much like it's happened in the pop culture that we live in now, there's less of that, right? And more of, hey, do your thing. It's all about you, which is cool, right? But that's not really delving into the text.
Right. That's a general
it's
trend.
A general thing. Absolutely. Not just the black community. It's a general trend. So what happens is
we have it in our community too.
Right. Yes, sir. Absolutely.
I'm guilty of that. We all are. We have to, we're all trying to popularize the message.
Yes. Right. And we as men of the cloth, right. We always want to make it relevant, right? And we always, Rabbi, we have to kind of balance making it relevant to at the same time being true to the text, right? Yeah, being true to the actual, what my Jewish friends call the Peshat, right? What was the actual meaning here? How do we actually do this? That way we still at least stay stay true to what we believe, right? And so what you're doing now, for example, so for these young black men who are on social media, which has like been the main fuel of this, or you're walking down the street and you see these guys dressed in what I call bad holiday costumes. I mean, they have their things on, they're preaching. But here's the problem, Rabbi. They're reading Joel, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Habakkuk. They're reading prophets that by and large in the Christian church today, those books don't even exist, right? We pastors, we read Malachi to tell people to pay their tithes. Other than that, we don't have any use for Malachi, right? And this is what's going on. So they're reading these scriptures. First of all, he's reading something I didn't even know was in my Bible, right? Secondly, now he's misinterpreting it, but he already has his foot in the door because he showed me where it says, and he's showing me things like Egypt and Ethiopia. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12, he said from the four corners of the earth, and he's naming these African and Middle Eastern lands. It's right there in the scriptures, right? I'm going, wow, I never even seen this before, right? So now I'm bringing this back to a pastor who may or may not know these things. If he can't give me a legit answer, that's another reason why I'm going over to here to this thing, right? So answer to your broader question, it is growing. We don't know the numbers. I'm sure at some point, if our organization had enough resources, because doing surveys costs a lot of money to actually commission those things and have those things actually done, we could kind of see. What I can tell you, Rabbi, and all the listeners is this. The number one comment that I get from black pastors now, right? When it comes to this radical group, they are not fans. They are not fans for certain different reasons. Number one, oftentimes these young people, right, are not only yelling at white people on the street corners and yelling at the quote unquote fake Jews, they're very disrespectful to pastors. These groups will go to churches on Sunday in the parking lot, passing out flyers telling people your pastor's a liar, right? That's not really the way to win friends and influence people, right? So at that point, many black pastors that I've talked to across the country, that's how they've been introduced to these groups, right? Not in a let's sit down and have a dialogue, but these guys calling me liar, that type of thing, right? Instead of having a real conversation, a legit conversation about the text and about scripture and prophecy, it's more of a let's attack the pastors and everything. And so, Rabbi, it is growing, but we don't know the actual numbers.
Wow. Well, thank you for illuminating this. I assume that the work you're doing with your Institute for Black Solidarity, with Israel, you're working more with trying to highlight the genuine connection that blacks and Jews have and should have, and Israel and Africa have and should have, as opposed to shutting this group down, I assume. What should we be doing? If you're saying they are influencing, because you're saying they're not influencing people in an intellectual kind of way, but because things are getting dumbed down, they are having some sort of influence on your typical African American. Because here's my major concern is that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Right. We want to speak out against it. And I know you speak out against it, and we in the Jewish community greatly appreciate that. But we don't want people on the street, attributing ill will to us because there's some vague idea that we took something that belonged to them. And
yes, sir.